All right, I'm here today to talk about what is generally known as the lost cause movement. A very contested issue in American history. And I want to dedicate this talk to the memory of Aaron Wolfe. You see him here on the cover of Chronicles magazine. Many of you are readers, no doubt. He died on Easter Sunday of this year, 46 years of age, suddenly, unexpectedly, left behind a wife and 6 children, and for 20-some years was an editor at Chronicles. For the last few of those years, its executive editor. And I worked with him for over 15 years as a colleague and also as a freelance editor, so would call him a friend as well. What I can say is that Aaron was one of those who believed that the lost cause movement never ended. And he fought that good fight throughout his adult life. All right. I called this, the title of this talk is The Graves of Thermopylae. For those of you who aren't terribly familiar with your ancient Greek history, Thermopylae was the site of a famous battle between the Greeks and the Persians, the Athenians and Spartans against the Persians in 480 BC. The term Thermopylae means hot gates. It was a narrow pass along the coast which the Greek defenders maintained for 3 days against overwhelming odds. They eventually gave way and the Persians invaded, but nonetheless it has been referenced many, many times in literature and in history as an example of a doomed but noble battle. On May the 10th, 1871, the Reverend John L. Girardeau, at that time pastor of the Zion Presbyterian Church in Charleston, delivered a Confederate Memorial Day address at Magnolia Cemetery on the western bank of the Cooper River. That gathering was also the occasion of the reinternment of 84 soldiers who served in Kershaw's brigade, not quite a third of the roughly 300 South Carolinians slain at Gettysburg in 1863. After that fateful battle, the Confederate dead had been hastily buried in the poorly marked graves reserved for traitors, but were recovered by the diligent efforts of the Ladies' Memorial Association of Charleston. Reverend Girardeau's address was remarkable in enunciating many of the themes that would become, over the course of the next several decades, the central motifs of the lost cause movement's public oratory and literature. The Confederate dead were, Girardeau asserts, a peculiar people, a people set apart. So it was not inappropriate that they should have slept apart in death as in life, adhering to a noble and sacred, though a despised and execrated cause, end quote. But having been returned to their native soil, they would have a fellowship in death that had been denied them, their dying wish fulfilled by the efforts of their countrywomen, who with gentle hands removed them from alien graves. He calls upon Carolinians to award these dead the same honor that would have been theirs had they returned as conquering heroes, for they are the heroes of a defeated but glorious cause. Though they themselves never knew defeat, for they died never having, quote, looked at a conqueror's flag flying over the citadels of a sovereign state. Fitting also it is, he adds, that they should lie among those who defended, quote, yonder battered and rugged fortress, which though often assaulted, was never carried by storm, end quote. A clear allusion to the ruins of Fort Sumter, not quite visible a few miles away at the mouth of Charleston Harbor. Girardeau then delivered a lengthy polemic that might seem inappropriate for a funeral oration. One would certainly expect some words about the nature of the cause for which the Gettysburg dead sacrificed their lives, but he went well beyond that, mounting what was in fact a frontal assault against those forces of radicalism that in his view were the cause of the war, and which in 1871 continued to threaten the identity of the Southern people. Deep as is the grief, he intones, we are not here just as mourners of the dead. There are living issues which emerge from these graves which demand our earnest attention. Given the broader context in which this Confederate Memorial Day service took place, we can be sure that Girardeau's audience was prepared and expectant. They had not come simply to hear the dead eulogized. However, under the Reconstruction regime, unrepentant advocacy of the Confederate cause was, of course, a treasonous act. Even a man of the cloth was not immune to the arbitrary authority of the occupation. For this reason, perhaps, the remarks of Reverend Girardeau were never explicitly directed at the military authorities in South Carolina. Nevertheless, he begins with the question which must have been a pressing one for those Southerners who survived the conflict, who found much of their world and all of their aspirations reduced to rubble. It is the question out of which the Lost Cause movement originates. Was this sacrifice a useless one? Was this precious blood spilt in vain? If the Confederate dead were truly rebels against lawful authority, then, quote, the principles upon which they acted ought to be abandoned. But Girardeau clearly does not believe that the authority against which they struggled was lawful. Nor does he believe that those principles which drove them into the teeth of the federal guns at Cemetery Ridge should be abandoned. For the forces against which they struggled were awakened by a spirit of radicalism that began in Europe and spread like an alien infection to the United States. By radicalism, he refers to an ideology of anarchic revolt against the natural and harmonious order of family, state, and church. But more generally, he seems to mean any egalitarian force that would dissolve natural hierarchies. The ruthless, leveling spirit of radicalism wages war against hearthstones, graves, altars, and temples, all borne down under its tempestuous eruption. Nothing is safe from it. There is no sanctuary it will not invade, no just, holy, time-honored sanction it will not violate, end quote. While he never refers explicitly to the abolitionists, it's evident that they embodied the spirit of radicalism which had swept away the constitutional principles of the founders. It was this same spirit that made government the instrument of a faction, and then proceeded to pervert the original intent of the Constitution, particularly the guarantee of autonomy to the states. Thus, the Confederate dead were not rebels against lawful authority. They were, in fact, the champions of liberty against the usurpers of lawful authority. Yet, Girardeau's polemic probes deeper still. Echoing John C. Calhoun, he argues that effective government answers to two fundamental human wants, liberty and protection. Of these, the need for protection or security is the more fundamental. When the spirit of liberty becomes, quote, the desolating misrule of anarchy, end quote, then the people who suffer under its sway will seek protection in despotism. But the habits of unregulated liberty are not so easily suppressed. The likely result is a, quote, mechanical union between the imperial and the popular element, a democratic absolutism. Girardeau seems to be thinking here of Napoleon III, but he implies that the emergence of the Republican party-state monolith under Lincoln and his successor was also a union of popular and imperial elements. This iron body attached to feet of clay, he ventures to prophesy, may in the not-so-distant future bring the whole of the civilized world under its totalitarian sway. A great imperial despotism resting upon the uncertain masses of a fierce democracy. In short, Girardeau conjures up in language approaching the apocalyptic an updated image of the Hobbesian Leviathan, which is also an image of the Antichrist. It was against this Leviathan state, which sought to eradicate the regulated liberties of free men in the name of a radically egalitarian social agenda, that the Confederacy struggled and lost. However, Girardeau insists the Confederate cause is not lost. The principle of regulated liberty can never be truly lost unless the people themselves relinquish it. Quote, "It behooves us to cling to the principle as drowning men to the fragments of a wreck." He urges his listeners to preserve an attitude of protest against those radical influences which threaten to sweep away every vestige of constitutional rights and guarantees. Discreetly, he says, I presume not to speak of special political measures, but in what sounds very much like a modus operandi for the lost cause movement, he urges that an attitude of protest must begin with strenuous efforts to, quote, maintain our identity as a people. This identity is in danger of being lost, of being swallowed up in that of a people which, having despoiled us of the rights of freemen, assumes to do our thinking, our legislating, and our ruling for us, end quote. We must also, he insists, continue to wear the badge of mourning, which distinguishes us from a people inflated with material prosperity. Moreover, we must transform the sufferings endured for freedom's sake into a discipline that will save our virtues from decay. And then I will quote once more from him at length. Southern identity must be preserved by instituting peculiar customs and organizations, which will discharge the office of monuments perpetuating the past, by forming associations of a memorial character like that whose call gathers us here today, by collecting and publishing materials for our own history, and by appointing anniversaries by which we can commemorate the deeds of men who died for our fundamental liberties and constitutional rights. We may do it by scrupulously adhering to the phraseology of the past, by making it the vehicle for transmitting to our posterity ideas which once true are true forever. We may do it by the education we impart to the young, by making our nurseries, schools, and colleges channels for conveying from generation to generation our own type of thought, sentiment, and opinion, by stamping on the minds of our children principles hallowed by the blood of patriots. Sounds like a charter for the Abbeville Institute, does it not? For Girardeau, the lost cause was primarily a continuing struggle, one that would be waged both morally and culturally. Yet the popular image of the movement today is rather different. In recent decades, a number of scholars have promoted a version of the lost cause that emphasizes its nostalgic celebration of the myth of the Old South, on the one hand, and its forward-looking embrace of reconciliation with the North on the other. Indeed, Gaines Foster, possibly the most influential of these scholars, argues that the Lost Cause movement did not really begin until the 1880s, when it emerged as a mass movement under the auspices of the United Confederate Veterans, which organized well-documented annual reunions in cities all over the South. Whereas earlier interpreters of the movement, C. Van Woodward among them, had emphasized its radical sectionalism, Foster claims that the Lost Cause celebration effectively merged with the New South movement that had begun also in the 1880s to promote both reconciliation with the North and a program of Southern economic development that enshrined Yankee free labor principles and promoted a break with the agrarian traditions of the Old South. According to Foster, the mass appeal of the Lost Cause was in part due to the persistent anxieties that followed upon defeat. This is a common theme. And the need for rituals and a mythology that would play a compensatory role by restoring Southerners' battered pride. But just as important were the, quote, increasing fears generated by the social changes of the late 19th century, including economic crises, the enormous demographic changes resulting from mass immigration, the changing roles of women, and the rapid industrialization of American society. Yet another interpreter of the Lost Cause, Charles Reagan Wilson, has taken a different position, delving deeply into the evangelical influence on Southern culture during the antebellum era, and its continuing influence during and after the war. Wilson regards the Lost Cause as essentially a prophetic religious movement. I should pause just to say that the title of Wilson's book, which has now gone to 3 editions, I believe, is Baptized in Blood. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's worth reading. He understands, Wilson does, that much of the impetus for the movement came from outside the churches and that many of its themes were, properly speaking, secular. Nonetheless, so powerful was the evangelical consensus in Southern society that he feels justified in claiming that the Lost Cause movement was a form of civil religion, one significantly shaped by the churches and by theological concerns, but, quote, with the distinctive structure of secular institutions. Both of these approaches have their weaknesses. Much of Foster's research concentrates excessively on the 1880s and 1890s, and he suppresses or is simply unaware of a good deal of evidence that runs counter to his claim that the Lost Cause celebration was effectively absorbed by the rhetoric and aims of the New South movement. On the other hand, Wilson seems unaware of the degree to which many adherents of the Lost Cause did embrace the tenets of the New South. Moreover, his attempt to conceptualize the Lost Cause as a form of civil religion is forced and somewhat misleading. But even after those weaknesses are taken into account, the best scholarship has tended to reinforce Wilson's contention that the movement was most deeply rooted not in nostalgic glorification of the past, but in a prophetic resistance against Northern power and a reassertion of Southern identity. Most students of the Lost Cause recognize that among its earliest manifestations were the efforts of Southern women to recover and bury the bodies of the Confederate dead. The enormity of this task can hardly be exaggerated. Approximately 620,000 fatalities were the direct result of the conflict, and this harvest of death, as Drew Gilpin Faust has recently noted, was 6 times the death rate during World War II relative to the size of the population. Beginning immediately after the cessation of hostilities and continuing through Reconstruction, hundreds of memorial associations sprang up in communities across the South, usually directed by women from the antebellum elite, although many prominent men were active. It was out of such activities that the first Confederate Memorial Days emerged, which in turn, as we have seen, were frequently occasions of Lost Cause oratory. Over time, the associations concerned themselves not simply with burial and the care of cemeteries, but with monument building as well. According to Foster, the speeches on such occasions typically, quote, evoked the South's despair at the end of the war, praised the accomplishments of the Confederate dead, and defended the nobility of their actions, but devoted limited attention to accounts of the war or sectional issues. And even when these addresses did encroach upon political ground, Foster adds, they constituted only a small and perhaps a not very important part of the memorial movement. But Foster offers only limited evidence to support this claim, and much of that evidence comes from the period after Reconstruction. As W. Scott Poole has argued, taking issue with historians like Foster, quote, heavy emphasis on the lost cause in the 1880s and 1890s has led historians to ignore the role of the earliest organizations, groups that often emphasize defiance and rejection of Yankee mores rather than simple nostalgia and reconciliation with the North. Such defiance, he continues, grew out of the context of Reconstruction, a milieu that called into question whether conservative whites could successfully stabilize their social order. Numerous examples suggest the activities of the memorial associations were often political and defiantly sectional. South Carolina's W.K. Easley, a signer of the Ordinance of Secession, frequently spoke at memorial association gatherings across that state. In one 1866 upcountry gathering in Pendleton, Easley urged the women of that upcountry district to understand that memorial sites could also be symbols of resistance, like the graves of Thermopylae. Out of defeat may arise future triumphs. Quote, the bones of Pym and Hampden and Cromwell, he noted, were thrown to the dogs, and yet one day William of Orange stood in Whitehall and laid the basis of British freedoms. As a Catholic, that quote makes me a little nervous, but nonetheless, his point is well taken. In Columbia, the South Carolina Monument Association, under the direction of Louisa McCord, attempted in 1869 to erect a monument to the Confederate dead on the State House grounds in open defiance of the radical Republican legislature. After the legislature refused to accommodate the monument, the association placed their statue of a Confederate soldier among the Confederate dead in Columbia's Elmwood Cemetery. Then, in 1876, after the ascendancy of the Redeemers, the monument was removed to a site in front of the State House overlooking one of the busiest intersections in the city. I should point out that this is the monument from which the flag was removed. The flag stood just, I believe it was behind the monument within the last year that occurred. The history of the Columbia Monument is doubly significant because it provides evidence contrary to Foster's claim that such early monuments were deliberately placed in Confederate cemeteries rather than in public venues, the better to emphasize their purely memorial function. In this case, the ladies of Columbia had every intention of raising their monument as a symbol of resistance, but were originally denied that opportunity by radical Republicans. Historians who downplay the political significance of the memorial gatherings also overlook the symbolic implications of the lost cause ritual associated with these events, ritual which appears to have been common to both memorial gatherings and political rallies in the early and mid-1870s. General Wade Hampton, whose role in bringing to an end the Reconstruction regime in Columbia is well documented, made frequent appearances at memorial ceremonies. One such gathering in Sumter featured an allegorical tableau in which a beautiful girl representing the state and the captive people of South Carolina appeared on stage draped in chains. Similarly, at a political gathering in Winnsboro during the Hampton campaign in 1876, rebel yells greeted the general as he approached the speaker's platform, while a, quote, young girl with a cap and staff designated Liberty raised another young belle, a prostrate South Carolina, to her feet. Nearby stood a feminine justice bearing a sword. As the tableau unfolded, prayers were offered and a church choir led hymn singing. As Poole suggests, by the way, he's a historian at the College of Charleston, by juxtaposing Confederate symbolism with white womanhood and combining both these powerful ideas in the iconography of the South's revivalistic faith, celebrants of Confederate memory transformed onlookers into a true people's army for the coming revolution. In South Carolina, at least, the Lost Cause memorial associations and the Redeemers often walked hand in hand. While the memorial and monument associations were an important component of the lost cause, both early and late, its ideology was shaped in books and journals and through a variety of post-war Confederate organizations. During the early years of the movement, much of this activity took place in Virginia. Edward Pollar's book, The Lost Cause, Albert Taylor Bledsoe's Is Davis a Traitor?, Robert L. Dabney's A Defense of Virginia, and Alexander H. Stevens' Constitutional View of the Late War. All of these focus not only on the conduct of the war, but upon the justification for secession. Lengthy tomes, such as most of these were, certainly exerted an influence over the Southern intelligentsia. But much of the literary activity associated with the lost cause emanated from journals such as the Southern Review and one called The Land We Love, later renamed the Southern Magazine. In addition to these were historical societies, the most important being the Southern Historical Society, originally headquartered in New Orleans, then later in Richmond after it was effectively taken over by Jubal Early in 1874. Jubal Early is another name to conjure with in the Lost Cause movement. The Southern Historical Society was responsible for the publication of the voluminous Southern Historical Society papers, an effort largely directed by the Reverend J. William Jones, and coordinated a coalition of Confederate organizations in Virginia. These organizations, which included veterans groups and monument associations, sought not only to defend the South's role in the war, but to counteract what they perceived as the humiliation and transformation of the South, end quote, during Reconstruction. Referring to the extensive lost cause activities of the Virginians as a Confederate ghost dance, Foster attempts to show that theirs was a failed movement, largely because it failed to attract the popular support enjoyed by the Confederate celebration of the 1880s and 90s. Even their monument-building efforts, he says, generated limited public enthusiasm. Foster attempts to explain this by suggesting that Southerners simply weren't interested in fighting the battles of the war again, or endlessly rehashing states' rights arguments in lengthy books and articles that seemed to dwell obsessively on the past. There's no doubt some truth in this, but it hardly proves, as Foster seems to think, that these same Southerners were more interested in reconciliation with the North. In fact, Foster cites several other reasons for the failure of the ideological productions of the Virginia Coalition to inspire a mass movement, noting poorly managed membership drives, a somewhat elitist bias, reasons that seem more than sufficient to explain the problem without resorting to sheer speculation about the minds of the Southern masses, most of whom were, during the economic dislocations of that period, struggling mightily just to maintain hearth and home. But Foster does grudgingly admit that many of the ideas and arguments promulgated by the Virginians did eventually make their way into the popular lost cause lexicon. With one or two exceptions, historians of the lost cause routinely overlook the importance of its religious dimension. However, Southern churches had always been a locus for support of the Southern cause. While the necessity of slavery to the Southern way of life was a matter of debate, virtually all Southern clerics defended the superiority of a paternalistic agrarian system in which deference and noblesse oblige ensured social harmony and the general welfare, both moral and economic. While many clerics read the European socialists with some admiration, they feared egalitarianism as much as they deplored the mammonism promoted by the free labor state. Abolition they regarded as a threat not only because of its abolitionism they regarded as a threat not only because of its egalitarian social agenda, but because the abolitionists were the tools of Yankee capital and the free labor system. But above all, the abolitionists were the manifestation of a heretical brand of Christianity. For all of these reasons, and especially the last, Southern clergy regarded Mr. Lincoln's war as a sacred crusade, meaning a heretical sacred crusade. They agreed that their, quote, Southern sacred world was being threatened by a powerful enemy who twisted the grammar of the sacred to its own dark ends. After the war, both during Reconstruction and well into the first decade of the 20th century, Southern divines adopted the language of the lost cause and lent their support to its goals. Given their privileged access by way of the churches to the millions of intensely faithful Southerners, it would not be too much to say that it was primarily through the clergy that the lost cause ideology was transmitted to the wider culture. This occurred not only by way of Sunday sermons, but in church-sponsored journals and at lost cause gatherings where Protestant ministers, as we have seen, were invariably among the featured speakers. Even so, as some historians have noted, many of the Southern churches became dependent upon Northern sources of material support during the cash-strapped postbellum years, and many ministers did moderate their sectionalism and their criticism of Northern materialism as a result. But as Wilson has argued, many others remained faithful to the antebellum vision of the Northern Leviathan state as a serpent which had invaded, conquered, and then despoiled the Confederate Eden. While much of the lost cause sermonizing in the immediate aftermath of the war focused on themes of consolation, the overcoming of despair, and the mystery of God's providence, in time, some ministers roused themselves to trenchant criticism. Reconstruction brought not only oppressive political changes, but an influx of capitalist speculators and the threat that the agrarian virtues of the South might succumb to the materialism of a commercial civilization. In an 1872 address at Washington and Lee University, Presbyterian minister Benjamin Morgan Palmer warned of an impending crisis brought on by the looming industrialization of the South, which threatened the, quote, swift decay of virtue. He warned, quote, the spirit of materialism infused into all the transactions of business and common life is the angel of pestilence, dropping the seeds of death from its black wing wherever it sweeps. Wilson cites numerous examples of clergy who spoke in prophetic terms against the dangers Southerners faced as a triumphant Union sought to impose its will upon the defeated Confederacy. They denounced egalitarian propaganda in the schools, the feminist influence on Southern women, encroachments upon state autonomy and freedom of worship, and rising class antagonisms provoked, at least in part, by Reconstruction policies. But the most far-seeing of the clerics returned again and again to the economic theme. Perhaps the most important analysis in this vein was formulated by R.L., sometimes simply Robert, Dabney, a figure whom Wilson mentions but does not do sufficient justice to. Dabney, a name that most of you are probably familiar with, was closely connected to the Lost Cause Coalition in Virginia and served for a year during the war as Stonewall Jackson's chief of staff. He also spent several years as a pastor and as a professor of church history at Virginia's Union Theological Seminary, and was later at the University of Texas in Austin, where he was a founder of the Austin School of Theology. He trained hundreds of seminarians for pastoral duties in Southern churches. Throughout the postbellum period until his death in 1898, Dabney wrote numerous books and articles espousing the lost cause in its most uncompromising form. What Dabney understood better than most was that the Leviathan against which the Southern people struggled was in fact a two-headed beast, not simply a centralizing, single-party despotism, but one which, in collusion with the rising power of corporatism, threatened to reduce the masses of so-called free laborers to the level of a mechanized proletariat. In fact, the very form of incorporation itself, claims Dabney in an article called Industrial Combinations, published in The Land We Love in 1868, is antithetical to the requirements of a modern republic. While certainly no socialist, he argues that charters of incorporation essentially granted special privileges to big business and were an invidious example of class legislation. For they promoted enormous class inequalities, destroyed the impartial role of government in the marketplace, and were inherently discriminatory against those who, like small farmers, were unable to adapt to a corporate structure. Charters of incorporation and special tariffs inevitably gave rise to monopolies, which in turn enabled the establishment of oligarchical power behind the facade of democracy. Sound familiar? Such charters required a diffusion of ownership via shareholders only indirectly tied to management, thus undercutting the role of the individual and moral conscience, not only in the conduct of business, but in the manipulation of elected officials. Gilded Age business magnates, Dabney notes, brought state legislatures as, quote, openly as railroad bonds and cargoes of corn. And I should point out that this is largely substantiated by C. Vann Woodward's book, Origins of the New South, which remains, to my mind, probably the best work on that subject. Much of Dabney's critique of the transformations wrought by incorporation is confirmed by a more recent scholar, Alan Trachtenberg, who also notes that the collusion of the federal government with the corporate financial sector was enormously enhanced by the Legal Tender Act of 1862 under Lincoln, which, quote, increased the money supply by authorizing the issue of fiat paper money by the central government for the first time, and by the creation of a national banking system in the following year, which, quote, established a key role for the federal government in the making of a unified national system of finance. Of course, Dabney's chief concern was the South, and especially the fate of its agrarian traditions as the New South movement gained ground. Like many of the most stalwart voices of the Lost Cause movement, he was alarmed by the plight of the Southern Yeomanry. In South Carolina in 1886-87 alone, over 200,000 acres of farmland were forfeited due to the inability of the owners, mostly small freeholders, to pay their taxes. In Dabney's view, there were several reasons for this. Prices for commodities necessary to the farmers were inflated by industrial monopolies and protective tariffs, as were the freight charges levied by the transportation industry, and property taxes, which were excessive. Unable to incorporate to protect their interests, yeomanry were forced off the land and often enough into what Dabney termed festering manufacturing villages as white wage slaves. Take a trip up to Charlotte and visit the New South Museum, where they celebrate this process of transforming the yeomanry into white wage slaves. But of course, they don't use quite that terminology. The conversion of a proud yeoman class into a white proletariat, which had been underway in parts of the North for some time, was now rapidly progressing in the South. In the South Carolina upcountry, there had been only 14 textile mills in 1880. By the turn of the century, there were nearly 100, and many of the older mills had expanded. Over a quarter of the stock in the South Carolina mills was controlled by Northern shareholders. For Dabney, this development augured cultural and economic disaster because, among other reasons, the yeomanry were the moral and civic backbone of the nation. Following Jefferson and Calhoun, he believed that widely dispersed land ownership fostered those Republican virtues which were necessary to combat the rise of the new aristocracy of wealth. As dispossessed small farmers were driven off the land and into cities and industrial towns, Dabney argued in 1890 they became easy prey for the agents of class warfare, resulting in, quote, lava streams of anarchy and revolution, which could rend the whole superstructure of society. Finally, I would like to consider Wilson's argument that the Lost Cause movement was, in fact, a form of civil religion. He cites Robert Bella's definition of a civil religion as the, quote, religious dimension of a people through which it interprets its historical experience in light of transcendent reality, end quote. Wilson draws attention to the prophetic element in civil religion by which the behavior of a nation is judged, quote, against transcendent values. Yet for Bella, American civil religion was, and in its essence, inclusive, point that Wilson largely ignores. It began with the Revolution of 1776, drawing both upon secular Enlightenment as well as Puritan and Revivalist traditions, and is sustained by a universal faith in the democratic destiny outlined in the American Creed. That's the way Bella sees the American civil religion. Wilson admits that the religiosity of the lost cause, at least before the 1890s, differed significantly from the sort of civil religion described by Bella. Southerners were not much influenced by Enlightenment values, and they celebrated Republican virtue rather than democratic inclusivity. Thus, he is forced to argue that Southern civil religion emerged sui generis as a distinct phenomenon after the war and flourished as a separatist alternative to the dominant American civil religion until it was absorbed into the democratic and imperialistic triumphalism of the World War I era. But Wilson would have done better to argue that lost cause religiosity, though it may have aspired to become a civil religion, was doomed from the start to fail in that aspiration. Indeed, Wilson seems implicitly to recognize this. The years leading up to World War I, he writes, quote, provided the perfect context for Southerners to embrace reconciliation for the North, or with the North. While sectionalism was still a significant force in the culture and in Southern churches, there were already those who at the turn of the century were proclaiming the complete reconciliation of the blue and the gray. Reflecting upon the eagerness with which many Southerners had embraced the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Reverend B.A. Owen of Kentucky, a chaplain for the United Sons of Confederate Veterans, suggested that the invasion of Cuba had been providential. It had provided an opportunity for a reunited America to bring liberty to the captives of Cuba and afforded Southerners the privilege of, quote, participating in the saving work of a successful Redeemer nation. But not all of those who continued to evoke the lost cause in its waning years were as sanguine as Reverend Owen. Most continued to insist that the South had a special prophetic role to play in what would later be termed the American century. They argue that the suffering experienced by the South during and after the war between the states had set it apart for a godly purpose. The South, in their view, best exemplified the Republican virtues of the American founders, and its destiny was to call the nation back to that original vision. Year by year, however, the militant and separatist rhetoric of the first lost cause generation was largely absorbed into a New South rhetoric of conciliatory optimism. Increasingly, the idea that the South had fought for the concrete and regulated liberty embodied in the provisions of the 10th Amendment was replaced by an abstract notion of universal liberty that easily fell into lockstep with Woodrow Wilson's ambition to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson, as you probably know, was a Southerner. When the U.S. entered World War I, that move was widely, I meant Woodrow Wilson. That move was widely embraced in the South, not least by its ministers. One of these, Randolph McKim, exploited the lost cause adulation of Robert E. Lee to call upon Southerners to regard the war against Germany as another sacred cause, much like the struggle against Northern aggression. Reverend McKim insisted that, quote, Germany must be crushed if civilization is to be saved, if the world is to be made safe for democracy. The president's crusade, he asserted, must become a holy cause for all Americans. Those who opposed entry into the European conflict he attacked as weak-kneed, chicken-hearted, white-livered pacifists. And if the pacifists' opposition to the war be correct, he asked, how could Robert E. Lee have been such a saint as he was? Incredibly, McKim had served under Lee as a young lieutenant and had even published a book on the general, The Soul of Lee. However, it doesn't appear to have occurred to him that the great Virginian would have been appalled by the imperialistic warmongering that resulted in over 100,000 useless American deaths in World War I. But substantial numbers of latter-day lost cause advocates believed that somehow the lost cause had been vindicated by the Allied victory in 1918. For them, the Confederate and Allied causes had been, in essence, the same. All of this speaks volumes about the degree to which the lost cause movement had been shorn by the second decade of the 20th century of that tragic gravitas that had been the predominant tone of Reverend Giraudeau's address at the Magnolia Cemetery in 1871. The lost cause movement was born out of tragedy, and its most authentic manifestations have always been deeply imbued with tragic awareness. Civil religion, on the other hand, is essentially optimistic. Bella argues that the American civil religion was somehow strengthened and deepened by the experience of Gettysburg, though it is hard to see much evidence of that today. The Lost Cause movement, through its ceremonial activities, enabled a generation of postbellum Southerners to assimilate the crushing defeat that Providence had dealt them. More than this, though, it provided a prophetic program of political and theological resistance against an enemy which, in time, eroded that resistance primarily from within. With the passing of the generation that could claim first-hand experience of defeat, the tragic awareness that belied the Yankee doctrine of progress receded, and inevitably, perhaps, was replaced by that very doctrine, however colored by evangelical hues. Today, few Southerners even notice the passing of Confederate Memorial Day, alas. Much less take the time to place flowers on the graves of the Confederate dead. Big-name country music stars urge Southerners to embrace the global war on terror, courtesy of the red, white, and blue, and most Southerners are more than willing to oblige. Not much has changed since World War I, but the legacy of the Lost Cause program of resistance remains. The ideas embraced by Dabney and Giraudeau remain more vital today than ever. The corporate Leviathan state has achieved what may well be the apex of its power and prestige. But as we have seen in recent years, widening cracks are beginning to appear in its facade. If Robert Dabney were alive today, he would perhaps have reason to believe that the cause is not, after all, lost. That's it.